Fighting Through Second World War podcast, episode 98. World War II snipers, the men, their guns, their story. Part 2. More great unpublished history. Hello again and welcome back to part 2 of this sniper special featuring the book World War II Snipers, the men, their guns, their story by Gary Yee. I've got another great lineup of stories for you featuring female snipers, British veteran Harry Furness, the psychology of sniping, and stories from Crete and Sicily, along with one or two more surprises. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, and this is part 2 of the latest sniper feature. So if you haven't heard episode 97 yet, I'd recommend you stop listening to this episode, 98, and jump back to 97. And I'm going to start this episode not with a sniper story, but a family story from listener Mark Petricevic, who featured in the last episode as well. Mark's from West Michigan, and he's written, "My wife's family was in occupied Yugoslavia during the war. Here's a story from her grandmother, and to set the visual, it's a very small, rural village, just 3 houses, and she was not even 5 feet tall, and maybe 90 pounds, so that's about 6.5 stone. They lived in a small village in what was Yugoslavia, near Krupa na Verbasu. There was no road to the village until about 15 years ago. The nearest road was about 5 kilometres away. Listener, I've posted a photograph of the house that Mark sent me so you can picture the scene. If you recall the history of the area, they were fighting an internal civil war as well as the Germans. You had the Chetniks, loyal to the government at the time of the German invasion, the partisans, communists, and many people who worked for the Germans, like the Stasi, Croatian fascists, and they were all active in the area. The house sits on a mountainside with a basement which is part exposed on the downside of the mountain slope. It's a small 3-room house that has been around for centuries. The basement is divided into 2 sides by a wall of interwoven branches coated with mud to separate the 2 rooms. One part of the basement acts as a cellar and is accessed by a trapdoor under the kitchen table. The other is a walk-in door from the outside on the downside of the slope, and animals are usually kept there. Grandmother is home with her 5 children and is approached by the partisans. Keep in mind, if the Germans found out you helped any of the parties against them, the entire village was executed. She's told to give them food and a place to spend the night. They were not asking, and refusal was not an option. She makes a meal, and right after she's finished up, she sees Germans approaching down the valley. She tells the partisans to get in the basement through the trapdoor. The Germans arrive and want food as well, and a place to spend the night. Again, she has no choice in the matter, but now she's thinking there is no way that the Germans won't notice or hear the partisans in the cellar. Or perhaps one of the young children will give it away, as innocent children do. She thinks she's done for, as well as her 5 children and the entire village, who will be executed for harbouring the enemy. The Germans eat and decide to sleep in the other side of the basement. They didn't notice the trapdoor. So there's a thin wall of woven branches with mud separating the Germans and the partisans for the entire night, as her and the children have a sleepless night right above them. If one of the partisans had coughed, snored, passed gas, etc., the charade would have been up, and she'd have had a battle in her house. The next morning, The Germans were up early, ate breakfast and departed. Grandma, all 90 pounds of her, rips open the trapdoor, starts beating the partisans with her broom, and using the ever-present Serbian cuss words, unceremoniously ushers the partisans out of the house, while continuing the beating. They all knew what they had narrowly avoided, and how they had endangered the family and the village. She swears her hair turned grey that night. As a little afterthought from Mark, he says, "In the US we sent soldiers to fight on distant battlefields. Where my wife grew up, the war was in their house." Mark, thanks for that story, and just a quick plug by me for your company, because I took a look at your website and it's called World War Supply, and you're a military accessory dealer. You're veteran owned and you supply historically accurate repro militaria from around the world. And you supply reenactment groups, prop houses, US military groups, collectors and more. And I think I missed that subtlety when I mentioned you in the last episode, so I hope that makes up for it. There's a link to World War Supply in the show notes. I think I need a new segment for this show called the Just Before segment, because there seems to be so many times when I'm about to do something and I say, just before we get to this, I'm going to do something else. And on this occasion, it's again so true, because I was going to talk about women snipers. But just before I do that, I want to talk about Gary Yee, because I've just been reading the blurb on the back of the book about Gary, and I think his pedigree deserves a little bit of recognition, because this is what it says. A former law enforcement officer, armourer and firearms instructor, Gary Yee has written extensively on the muzzle-loader sharpshooter. He's been a guest curator for the San Francisco Veterans Building and Francisco Fort. No stranger to firearms upon retirement, he studied gunsmithing at Trinidad State College, where he's presently an adjunct instructor. And when not writing, Gary builds flintlock rifles, hunting pouches and powder horns. Besides belonging to the Contemporary Long Rifle Association, the Honourable Company of Horners, he's also a life member of the National Muzzle Loading Rifle Association, the National Rifle Association, and the Company of Military Historians. So I think that just about qualifies you to write this book, Gary. Well done, that man, for such an illustrious career. And on top of that, Gary has previously written another book called Sharpshooters, 1750 to 1900, The Men, Their Guns, Their Story. So this new one's a kind of first cousin to it, being called World War II Snipers, The Men, Their Guns, Their Story. Moving back to Gary Yee's book now, I'm going to turn straight away to the section on women. There's a lot in the book featuring female snipers, and this one starts with a Russian women's school of sniper training. Central Women's School of Sniper Training. While Lyudmila Pavlichenko is easily the most famous female Soviet sniper of the war, she was not unique. There were many other women who broke from the traditional female roles and became warriors. Under the Soviet constitution, women enjoyed equal rights and obligations to society, as the men did. However, this did not extend to women serving as soldiers. As early as a month into the war, patriotic Soviet women who were refused admission into the armed forces served as guerrillas if they lived in occupied areas. It wasn't long before women began entering the ranks in auxiliary roles: nurses, medics, communication specialists, clerks, typists. This soon extended to fighting roles for Soviet women, which included artillerists, anti-aircraft gunners, tankers, and bomber or fighter pilots. Perhaps the most unique thing the Soviet Union did for sniper development was its creation of the Central Women's School of Sniper Training, which served 1939 to 45. Set up to train female snipers, it was a boot camp that specialised in training snipers. Its first class graduated in June 1943. Cadets were members of the Young Communist League between 18 and 22 years of age, and candidates were selected on the basis of keen eyesight and prior shooting experience. They were subjected to further screening and, if not accepted, sent off for training in other specialities. Those who remained were organised in groups of 10 or 11 by height, and then as trainees were given boys' haircuts. The tallest were in the first platoon and the shortest in the last. It's speculated that the reasoning was probably foxhole size that would work for each pair as well as clothing issuance. Paired off, much like the comrades de bataille, they trained together, sat next to each other during class, and slept next to each other on bunk beds. The Soviets wanted them to rely on each other. At the front, for example, if they had only 2 greatcoats, in the absence of a blanket, one could be placed on the ground and the other shared as a blanket. Reveille was at 0600 hours, and they were marched a mile to the river to wash. At the canteen, they had to learn to eat fast if they wanted to finish their meal. Returning to the barracks, they were taught theory, which included ballistics and their equipment. Besides range practice, there was also plenty of drill. There was no shortage of marching, during which they all had to sing. Failure to sing resulted in punishment. Down, crawl. Yulia Zhukova said there were no textbooks to read or study, so classes were taught by lecture and field training. She was shown no instructional films when she attended. Sometimes an experienced sniper like Vladimir Chelintsev visited the school to share his Leningrad sniping experience. Other classes included different types of foxholes, camouflage, night ambush, and patience. Navigating the terrain, stalking, observation, and memory development, especially of the landscape and details. Hand-to-hand combat and grenade throwing. During target practice, they first dug and camouflaged their foxholes before shooting at targets that were full-sized, waist upward, chest upward, running and fixed. They used the standing, kneeling, supported and unsupported, firing on the move and while stationary. After all the shooting was done, they had to practice their crawling to recover their spent cases. Among the instructor cadre were graduates from the first class of cadets, now promoted to sergeant, or male officers who'd been injured and reassigned from front-line duty. They were harsh, but only because they'd seen the horrors of combat and wanted to prepare them for it. When the class graduated after 3 or 6 months, when first opened the school lasted 3 months, and by the end up to 7. The instructor sergeants were promoted to officers and accompanied them to the front. Most of the newly minted officers softened since they were no longer at the school. One who didn't, Sergeant Shatrova, continued to find fault with them. She died at the front, and those who knew her suspected she was killed by her own platoon. Since the programme was very demanding, naturally there were failures. Dropouts were reassigned to other duties. Many women served as signallers, nurses or clerks. 2 women actually deserted, but were caught and sent to a penal company. One shot herself in the foot. Her classmates in the platoon suspected she did it because she was afraid of being on guard duty alone, in the dark, and too ashamed to admit it, especially if they came from Komsomol, the Young Communist League. Their final exit exam was not a written test, but a practical one. Each student was given a different task and then told to execute it. Zhukova was instructed to destroy an enemy machine gun nest. She began running and heard enemy machine gun fire. She immediately dropped and crawled sideways toward cover. From it, she began scanning the land in front of her. She scanned the left and right, observing it for anything that looked out of place. Failing to find anything, she continued scanning methodically from left to right and right to left. Time passed and she feared failing. She finally spotted the machine gun's barrel. It was barely discernible to her. After much deliberation, she carefully aimed and struck the target behind it. Zhukova passed with an excellent grade and was promoted to sergeant. School began to wind down. Her class had a day of rest. A graduation ceremony followed by an evening banquet that included wine. Before departing, they were issued padded jackets and trousers, warm underwear, new foot wrappings, mittens with a finger for the trigger finger, and even white American socks. They marched out, 559 strong, with the school's unfurled banner leading, the brass band playing patriotic music to the well wishes of Soviet citizens as they made their way to the railroad station for their journey to the front. Initially, there was some reluctance at the front to accept female snipers. Sergeant Bella Epstein recalls, "When we arrived at the 2nd Belarusian Front, they wanted to have us stay at division headquarters, meaning, 'Here, women, why go to the front line?' 'No,' we said, 'we're snipers. Send us where we're supposed to go.' Then they said, 'We'll send you to a regiment where there's a good commander. He takes care of girls.' There were all sorts of commanders, so we were told. The colonel met us with these words, 'Look out, girls, you've come to fight, so fight, but don't get up onto anything else. There are men around and no women. Devil knows how else I can explain things to you. It's war, girls.' He understood that we were still very young things." When the war broke out, 17-year-old Nina Lobkovskaya attempted to enlist. Rejected as too young, she stayed in school and, like Pavlichenko, became active in the Osoviakhim and earned the Voroshilo Marksman Award. Because of her skill, she was sent to the Central Women's School of Sniper Training. She describes her school training. "As soon as I started studying, I realised that the mere desire to fight the enemy was not enough. You had to have skill too. Women are said to be more patient than most men and therefore make good snipers. But we discovered that being a sniper is a difficult art, and we mastered it only after months of daily lectures and training. We'd go to the firing range at dawn and return after dark, tired and dirty. In winter, it wasn't easy to crawl with a heavy rifle through the snow and try to hit the target when your fingers froze on the trigger. It was equally tough performing long marches with a full pack on your back." Lobkovskaya was in the first class to graduate from the Central Women's School of Sniper Training. In June 1943, she, along with 50 other female snipers, was initially assigned to 3rd Shock Army of Kalinin Front, during the Battle of the Pachinska Heights, which ended on July the 6th. She and her partner, Leningrada Vera Artmoneva, went to the 21st Guards Rifle Division, and on the first foray onto the battlefield, decided to use a destroyed Russian tank as their lair. She goes on. We could see the German trenches rather well, but it was almost impossible to shoot from inside the tank. Out of nowhere, we were under artillery fire. Shells were exploding right next to us. The tank was shaking from the explosions of the shells hitting us from all sides. We were scared stiff and sure that it was the end of us. Then the artillery fire stopped just as suddenly as it had started. When our soldiers saw just where we'd taken up our positions, they really gave us an earful. They told us that we should avoid taking up such a highly visible observation post, which the enemy often used as a reference point. After that misadventure, the command attached an experienced soldier, a frontovik, to each sniper pair. We got a soldier named Chernik. And this next story is about Klavdia Kalogina, who was just 15 when the war started. She immediately went to work in a munitions factory where she joined the Komsomol, which required her to complete her secondary education. When the Central Women's School of Sniper Training opened, at age 17 she was the youngest to join. Initially they had to build the school, so she chopped wood, carried water, and helped construct the target range. Her shooting was dismal until her squad leader, Marusia Chivenska, took her under her wing and personally coached her. They fired up to 1,200 metres, but most of the time it was 200 to 300 metres. Instruction included firing in crosswinds and moving targets. She learned to fire only once from any position and learned patience. If a shot could not be made, it was not to be taken. As a sniper, she carried 2 grenades. One was for the Germans and the other for herself. After graduating, they were sent as a 12-person squad to the front, where they initially became part of the 1156th Rifle Regiment. They were issued white camouflage coveralls and wrapped bandages around their rifles. The snow required the Germans to clear their trenches, and many Germans were exposed. However, Kalogina and squad leader Chikvinseva could not bring themselves to shoot. When they returned to their squad dugout, they learned of the success of the other snipers and reproached themselves for their hesitation. The next day, she killed a German machine gunner who was clearing his embrasure. After that, everyone only cleared their embrasures at night. Listener, the embrasure was the hole in the parapet or the ground or whatever where they were aiming from. Aware that there were Soviet snipers present, the Germans summoned one of their own. Since snipers weren't that effective at night, the women watched the German lines in the day, and some men were posted at night. One ominous day, her partner Marusia Chikvenska had a sense of foreboding and told her commander, "I don't want to go, I can't go today," and asked to be excused from standing post. She was ordered to go anyway, and the pair began their watch, with Kalogina standing the first watch. Kalogina's eyes grew tired, and Chikvinseva offered to relieve her. "Let me take the watch now," said Marusia. Kalogina remembered. She got up. It was a sunny day, and she apparently moved the lens. As soon as she got up, there was a shot, and she fell. Oh, how I cried. She was my best friend. When they reached the Dnieper, the Germans had prepared some defensive works from which they dominated the terrain. Regiment Commander Leonid Verdikov ordered, "Eliminate them," Kalugina said. "There were maybe 12 of us. We aimed, and of course, we eliminated them." While fighting on the Dnieper, her longest kill was about a kilometre's distance against a machine gunner and an opposing sniper. You know, there is so much more of this that I could share with you, but I've got to move on. The Battle of Crete now, codenamed Operation Mercury, was a major Axis airborne and amphibious operation during World War II to capture the island of Crete. Fallschirmjäger of German 7th Airborne Division were dropped on the island on May the 20th, 1941. They were later reinforced by Gebirgsjäger of 5th Mountain Division. After heavy fighting, they overwhelmed the British Commonwealth and Greek defenders of the island, although at a high cost. Hitler refused to allow large airborne operations after this. Distinguishing himself as a counter-sniper on Crete, New Zealander Sergeant Alfred Clive Hume was running the Field Punishment Centre of the 23rd Canterbury Otago Battalion when the Germans arrived. Hume was raised on a farm in New Zealand and learned stalking as a child from having to round up cows. Some cows were particularly obstinate and would flee at his approach. To make his chore easier, he learned to stalk quietly without breaking any sticks, and so catch the cow by surprise and prevent it from running off. When the German Fallschirmjäger began to descend into the gullies near the Maleme airfield, he organised his men and they attacked the Germans with grenades. Trapped, more than 120 dead Germans were counted. When he returned to his battalion, he found he had no duties, and so took it upon himself to stalk the Germans. He'd acquired 2 items from parachutists he'd shot, which gave him some protection on his stalking patrols, and may possibly have misled the Germans. These were a camouflage suit or blouse which he wore over his battle-dress tunic and a camouflage hat which could be worn either rolled up like a balaclava or down in a hood with eye slits over the face. He'd also captured a Mauser sniper rifle from a weapons container dropped for the Fallschirmjäger. Unlike American and British practice, the German paratroopers did not jump with their rifles or machine guns, and they had to retrieve them from parachuted drop containers. Hume stalked Germans not only from the British lines, but also from within German lines. Knowing they liked high vantage points, he stalked the hills and often got within pistol distance to kill them. Then he had to evade detection and had to crawl backward downhill to safety. Hume also killed 9 Germans with a bayonet and 5 with his sheath knife. Other times he used the Mauser. His thirst for German blood redoubled when he learned his brother, Corporal Blondie Hume, of 19th Battalion, had died of wounds on May the 26th, 1941. He said, "At one stage, I found myself actually advancing with the Jerrys towards our own boys. Several of them were camouflaged, and so was I, so they took me for one of them. I lay alongside them as they fired and put my sights up to 700 yards so my shots would go high and I wouldn't hit my own cobbers. A German spoke to me. I knew no German and couldn't answer him, so I crawled over and knifed him. I walked up and down on the edge of a ridge to draw their fire while others watched, but they refused to be drawn. And then I happened to spot in the glow of the setting sun the glint of glass in an olive tree about 100 yards away. A Jerry was straddling a branch up against the trunk, and the glint of glass had come from his gas mask, which he'd worn all day, so that the white of his face couldn't be seen. We charged the olive grove at dusk and got the issue. Hume was injured when he fired at a German sniper because he forgot to adjust his sights for a lower elevation. The shot went high. The German sniper heard it, swung round and shot him. Injured in the shoulder, he was ordered to the rear. Hume would not go until he organised stragglers into groups, having killed numerous snipers. The official citation says 33, most of whom he'd stalked and killed from the rear, along with numerous other deeds. Hume was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was declared medically unfit and retired as a warrant officer in 1943. Another hunter of snipers was Tiny Pike, a musician from Auckland. After 2 Australians were killed by an unseen sniper, Tiny and 2 others set off to flank him at night. They departed, and some time later Tiny and his 2 comrades also parted company. The 2 returned, and nothing was heard of Tiny. 2 days later he returned to camp and had on him a POS Luger. His only comment was, "There's one so-and-so who won't do any more sniping." Finally, LAC Donald F. Cooper traded shot for shot with the Germans. Cooper wrote home stating, "But the enemy couldn't shoot for bean. Even the nearest only cut my helmet strap. What a place Crete was, and it sure was a game while it lasted. Now they're trying to make me out that I'm a blinking hero. You know, mentioned in dispatches. Well, I did bump off a sniper at 800 yards. I enjoyed the fight." After being evacuated from Crete, Cooper transferred to the RAF. I now want to reintroduce you to Harry Furness, who featured in my first sniper episode ages ago, episode 53. Harry was a 16-year-old Manchester lad who, like many across the country, decided he wanted to do his bit and took himself off to sign up for the infantry in 1941. Little were his recruiters to know that young Harry was to become one of the most successful snipers in the British Army history. Harry was with the Green Howards and landed on Gold Beach on D-Day. And here are a few secrets of Harry's craft that he's shared in the past. I just love these insights. It's like reading the survival tips for almost any survival craft, like camping and mountaineering. There's an obvious spirit of adventure in them, except in Harry's case, there's the element of battle involved. So here's some of Harry's tips. Concentrate on the reticle, not on the target. Listen, the reticle is like the crosshairs. The heavier your rifle barrel, the more solid you can hold, especially in a crosswind. A heavy rifle barrel is more tiring to carry, but when you are tired, you'll shoot a heavy gun better than a light gun, because your barrel will not wave in the breeze. When forward of your own troops, never be tempted to make use of a captured enemy sniper rifle. Each mecha weapon has its own distinctive sound bite, and friendly troops behind you hearing an enemy rifle out front are likely to bring heavy fire onto your position. The sniper who takes a great load of ammunition with him won't return. He'll shoot too much and they'll get him. Few snipers keep their gun books accurately. If a sniper's gun book records 2,000 rounds fired, recognise that the actual number is probably 4,000. Keep that in mind when you hear reports of 7.62 barrels being shot out in 2,000 rounds or less. On training, Harry said, "We study man tracking so that we'll know what someone following us will be looking for. Man tracking knowledge will help us to stay undiscovered and assist us in getting away. Being able to track an enemy could be valuable, but is secondary to our own safety." This book is stuffed with tips from Harry and others, and here's a couple more from him. When you observe an enemy patrol that you intend to engage, forget the point man and leave the officer or NCO in command for your second shot. Kill the radio man first, otherwise he'll call artillery in on your position. After you've killed the radio man and the officer, move your position as quietly as possible. Maybe later you'll get another shot at the leaderless patrol from your pre-chosen alternate position. Wow. Moving on to the Sicily campaign in 1943 now. Here is a lovely sketch about Sicily, and I've got to say I was quite surprised by this one. July the 9th to August 17th, 1943. Following the capture of Axis forces in Africa, the next major assault was Operation Husky, an airborne and amphibious assault against Sicily, which had to be captured before Italy itself could be invaded. The British 8th Army landed on the southeast coast of Sicily, and the 7th US Army's 2nd Corps, consisting of 1st, 3rd and 45 Infantry Divisions, on the central southern coast. British 1st Airborne Division was dropped near Syracuse, and the 82nd US Airborne around Gela. The 2nd of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was dropped too low. While 24 paratroopers suffered broken ankles or legs, the unplanned benefit of the low drop was that they were not overly dispersed, although they weren't where they were expected to be. Unfortunately, they found themselves among an Italian pillbox complex which they had to capture before they could safely move out. The battalion commander, Major Mark Alexander, was able to assemble about 475 men with whom he could accomplish this task. The pillboxes were captured by the morning, and they marched off toward the coast to join the Americans who were landing by sea. As darkness approached, they were just northwest of the coastal village of Marina di Ragusa. While settling in, they were subjected to machine gun and sniper fire from the north. Alexander summoned one of his officers, Lieutenant Arthur Miller. "Art, do you know Morse code?" When Miller responded affirmatively, Alexander ordered, "Well, do you see the outline of that British cruiser out there just offshore?" "Affirmative." "Then get a flashlight and signal that cruiser in Morse that there's a bunch of Krauts or eye-ties out to our front, and ask if they can plaster them with some big stuff." Lieutenant Miller scrounged up a flashlight from one of the troopers and began signalling the cruiser. Sceptical troopers looked on while others continued to shelter themselves. Then they waited. The silence of the night air was pierced only by the staccato of the machine guns and rifle fire. Suddenly the cruiser lit up with bright flashes, followed by the boom of its guns. The slope where fire was coming from erupted in flames and smoke. The harassment fire ended. Turning to Miller, Alexander instructed, "Flash our British friends a message that they were right on target, and be damned sure to thank them." American soldiers were probably not trained in warship recognition, and it's likely that it was an American cruiser, either USS Savannah or her sister USS Boys, that lent its 6-inch guns in support. Regardless of the ship's nationality, it proved that the 100-pound shells thrown by a cruiser's bigger guns worked wonder in silencing snipers and machine guns. Now, anyone who has listened to the various interviews on this show with the late veteran and radio operator and fighter, I should emphasise, Wilf Shaw, may recall him once rueing the fact that he'd had to learn and continuously practice Morse code, yet never once used it throughout the entire war. And yet here we are with a perfect example of why it had to be learned. What a great example. Enough said. And just to tie up on Sicily, lessons from the Sicilian campaign on the use of snipers and dealing with enemy snipers. Snipers were freely used by both Allied and Axis forces. The terrain and the nature of the campaign made effective sniping a valuable asset to all infantry units. Commanders recommended a higher degree of sniper training for units not yet in action, and pointed out that the capable sniper must be more than a crack marksman with a special rifle. The elements of patience, study of enemy habits, and the ability to operate and move with almost perfect concealment were all stressed. Frequent change of position after firing was also a point that was emphasised. Enemy snipers firing from concealed, delaying positions and from mountains were a major nuisance. Units learned to deal with them in a number of ways, the most effective of which was the use of specially trained squads of sniper killers. These groups would locate the hostile snipers, and part would engage the sniper's attention and fire, while the remainder would work around to the flanks and eliminate him. German snipers in civilian clothes were especially annoying in Sicily, since our troops had strict orders not to molest civilians. In the passage of towns, it became difficult to distinguish local civilians from German snipers in disguise. I'm now going to turn to the psychological aspects of sniping, and here's a story to start off. A comrade had set himself down on his trunk to bolster himself with his March rations and to smoke a pipe. And no doubt, sitting like that, he had been hit by the bullet of a Russian sniper. Death must have come over him very suddenly. Even in death, he had his pipe in his hand, his stiffened hands clutching it tightly, the bread bag lying open in his lap. He leaned in a sitting position, with his back on the trunk, and the ruptured, wide-open eyes seemed to be astonished at the suddenness with which his life had been taken from him. You could hardly make out the tiny bullet hole. So recorded Obergefreiter Otto Passasche of the 137th Infantry Regiment of the Gerbishjäger Division, which was fighting to capture Murmansk in 1941. Death came suddenly and unexpectedly, and from an unseen assailant. To say it was unnerving would be an understatement. Fear can increase the desire for self-preservation, and Julian Yakovlevich remembered going thirsty despite a nearby well. Once there was an episode. We were sitting in a trench, felt thirsty but couldn't drink anything, needed water. Someone went out to the well. One guy was shot, another guy was shot. No one else went. The knowledge that there was an enemy sniper reduced the effectiveness of an opposing unit. At least if one suspected where a shot came from, an artillery barrage or a smoke screen could help protect the targeted unit. While not a sniper, he was a mortarman. Unterofficer Hans Rehfeldt from the Großdeutschland Division describes harassing the Soviets. The intention of my shooting was to demonstrate to Ivan that we were keeping a watchful eye on a linesman's house. Through my binoculars, I could see the Russians running out through the front door of the linesman's house to their position. I got myself a rifle 98 instead of the shorter carbine 98. The longer barrel gave a better prospect of success against identified targets at the longer range. For a laugh, I aimed my first round over notch and bead at the crossframe of the window. What else would I aim at from a distance of 1,800 metres? Aiming at the centre of the house, the shot rang out. My messenger, watching through binoculars, reported that the bullet had fallen 100 metres short. I saw the water spray up. With the third or fourth round, holding the barrel higher, I hit the door while aiming at the chimney. Booby, with the binoculars, watched the door and waited. Booby, if you see somebody coming out of the door or going in, let me know, and I'll put a slug in him. Ha ha ha. I aimed calmly at the chimney. Waited a while. Unteroffizier, the door is opening. Somebody is coming out. I took a deep breath, aimed precisely at the chimney, and fired. Ha ha! That gave him a shock, my observer called out. Whenever there was any movement at the door, I fired. I didn't hit anybody, but they didn't use the door anymore. Sniper, they were probably thinking. Using the same reasoning, German super sniper Matthaus Herzenauer once shot at a standing Russian at 1,100 metres distance. It was not likely that I would hit him at that range, but the shot was necessary under the existing circumstances in order to make it clear to the enemy that even at that range he should not feel safe. Harassment has its own value and effect on the opposition. During the breakout for the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, the SS Assault Brigade, Wallonia, was harassed by an unseen assailant, Leon de Grelle remembered. Bullets kept coming every minute or two from the same spot. It took us a quarter of an hour to find the place where that marksman must have been hiding. He'd slipped silently away and posted himself in another watery, shadowy hole. We had scarcely moved off when the bullets began whistling past again, sharp, brutal, nerve-wracking. The result speaks for itself, and no doubt the Belgian volunteers received little respite. Similarly, when USMC correspondent Sergeant Bill Allen asked one unit, "What element of battle causes you the greatest strain?" sniper fire was the predominant response over night or riding the assault boats from ship to shore. Lyudmila Pavlichenko grasped how to unnerve attacking soldiers by shooting at the abdomen. Sometime in May 1942, there was an attack on the Soviet defences at Sevastopol. She was with Sergeant Fyodor Sedik when their part of the line was assaulted by two waves of Germans. Instead of aiming at the first wave, she suggested to Sedik that they shoot the second wave in the abdomen. They then proceeded to do so, aiming at the belt buckles to inflict mortal injury but not immediate death. Their victims howled in agony, and the cries unnerved the first wave. Similarly, defending against a Russian assault, German sniper Sepp Allerberger applied the same tactic against the Soviet fourth wave with similar unnerving results. Only when the first rank reached 50 metres did he begin shooting them too, all with headshots. Ordered to attack a town near the Arno River, the American 100th Infantry Battalion was in the lead. The uphill road went around a blind curve that had stone walls on both sides. No one wanted to chance going around it to reach the objective. Finally, a platoon sergeant volunteered and went around the curve, and was halfway up the hill when he was shot, probably by someone in the church steeple. After the sergeant was slain, the battalion refused to advance for the entire day because of what could have been a solitary rifleman. Sadly, it is time to draw to a close now, but I've got a few regulatory PSs coming up in a second, so do stay with me. One thing I'll have to apologise for is that there hasn't been anything mentioned about Normandy in this episode until now. So keep your ears peeled in the aforementioned PSs and we'll see what we can come up with. Just before them, I will say thank you to you, my listener, so very much for your support in too many ways to mention and for making the time to listen to me. I really do appreciate you. And please don't forget, if you aren't actually subscribed or following the show, then please, one more time, could I ask you to do so in the app of your choice. Subscribers make an enormous difference to my ratings in the charts. And if you've already subscribed on Apple or Spotify or whatever, I would be further eternally grateful to receive some reviews on those platforms. And I'll thank Andy Phillips from the UK, who literally did that just a couple of days ago. He just posted a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and Andy, thank you so much for making the effort. Finally, thanks to Gary Yee for getting in touch and sharing your World War II sniping book with us all, Gary. Superb stuff. And listener, if you want to buy it, there's a link in the show notes within your listening app. And that's World War II Snipers, 1939 to 45, The Men, Their Guns, Their Story, published by Casemate. And if you want to read a bit more of the book, there's more to see at a Google Books link in the show notes, and that includes more stories and a full contents page so you can see what you're getting. For the first PS, here's a short extract from Dad's book, Fighting Through, From Dunkirk to Hamburg. Funnily enough, Gary Yee did feature Dad's book several times in his own book. Here goes. On the 11th of June 1944, so just a few days after D-Day, C Company was moving forward in our usual extended line across fields, and upon reaching a cornfield, we continued to walk through the corn, which was waist high, until we were half across. Then all hell let loose upon us from trees 100 yards ahead, among which were snipers and machine gun posts. The snipers were after the NCOs and officers, and they were very successful too. It happened so suddenly, and the first officer to be killed by a shot in the head was our company commander, Captain Chambers, who'd taken over charge of C Company on the beach when Captain Lynn was killed. We also lost a Norwegian officer attached to us. We all called him Norgie, a first-class officer and a gentleman. Several NCOs and other ranks were also the victims of the attack, including Major Honeyman and Corporal Alexander. Major Young, Bert Hall, and a score of others were wounded. Our company sergeant major was shot through the throat. It was quite a nightmare while it lasted, but the angels must have been looking after me that day. PS2. Market Garden. You might recall the oh-so-funny story about the Italian being shot up the backside in episode 97. Well, here's a similar incident that followed after Market Garden. This is from Gary Yee. At the end of October 1944, the 101st moved up near Arnhem. Company E of the 506th relieved Company B. Edward Babe Heffron and his machine gun squad set up in a roofless barn whose sole occupant was a dead SS officer who had the night before demanded Company B's surrender. Their response was to shoot him. The Company B troopers left the officer's body by the cow because they figured that's where he belonged. This was the condition when Company E relieved them. In the morning, a German a long distance away stood up from his foxhole, put his thumb on his nose, and grabbed his crotch to taunt them. He did it again the following day. Company E called for snipers and got 2 British men. Heffron and the rest of the machine gun squad anxiously watched. The morning after that, we had the 2 British snipers sent to our line to take him out. They set up positions 1,200 yards away. He did his nose-thumbing thing again, and they shot, and missed. 1,200 yards was pushing the .303 Enfield bullet to the extreme. 600 to 800 yards would have been more reasonable. Heffron tells how their tormentor was finally dealt with. A sergeant with a 377 para-artillery that was attached to us devised a plan to get rid of him. He said, "I'll have a surprise for him tomorrow morning." Next morning, the Kraut stood up and did his thing. The sergeant picked up the phone, called in the coordinates and said fire, and the shells flew over our heads. They gave him what they call airburst. The shell blew up before it hit the ground and took the German soldier with it. We were all hooting and hollering. We have a law in combat. If you're a wise guy, you're on your own. Gary. Thank you, Gary. I think I teased you a little bit with the mention of Normandy, because that section from Dad's book was really only a teaser. And I think no self-respecting episode would be complete without covering Normandy in a little bit more depth. And I want this episode to be no different. So this is a section from Gary's book called Breakout from Normandy. And it's set in July 25th to the 31st, 1944, so a few weeks after D-Day. Here we go. Operation Cobra saw the Allies' strategy pay off, and Bradley's 1st US Army break through the German defences. Patton's 3rd Army, activated on August the 1st, was immediately fed into the gap and thrust forward against weak opposition. With the Germans' line broken, a pell-mell rush through France convinced soldiers and generals alike that the war would be over by Christmas. In our drive across France, the Germans couldn't get up an effective defensive line, but they sure as hell did everything they could to hurt and delay us. Their actions consisted of a good deal more than just mines and booby traps. For starters, they used snipers liberally. Our training never included anything at all, not even a mention about snipers. We learned about them through experience and heavy losses, There was always something especially eerie about these well-hidden, silent killers. They had an aspect of grotesque, like a spider popping out of its hole to snatch and devour its prey. Many of the German snipers were youths or older soldiers who were instructed to stay behind so the fitter fighting men could withdraw safely. Michael Bilter was like most young Americans of the era. He believed President Roosevelt's re-election assurances that America would not be involved in the war. Bilter attended the cinema, watched the Cubs baseball team play at Wrigley Field, danced to the music of Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey and Les Brown, and like other teenage American boys, chased girls. Torn from his happy life as a youth, Bilter was now a private in the 11th Infantry Regiment, 5th Infantry Division, that had landed in France on July the 9th. Their division belonged to the 3rd US Army's 20 Corps and was about to take part in the breakout. During Operation Cobra, Bilter and his friends learned fast how to minimise exposing themselves and improve their chances for survival. Those who didn't became casualties. Bilter recalled one incident where a senior officer neglected to conceal himself, with fatal consequences. I can't begin to describe how often replacements came into our ranks only to be killed a day or two later by snipers. We knew what to do and how to survive through our experience, but these green kids served as nothing more than target practice for German snipers. Yet despite their experience, even veterans made fatal errors on occasion. I remember one lieutenant colonel who was always preaching cover and concealment when it came to snipers. He forgot his own teaching one day and stepped from the jeep and walked across an open field rather than hugging the tree line around it. He was struck by a sniper's bullet and dead before he hit the ground. Also part of 3rd Army, the 80th Division 20 Corps had landed in France on August the 5th. By early September, it had reached the Moselle River. Private Warren Kenneth Coomer was busy digging a foxhole behind a boulder when a sergeant nearby decided to study the German position across the river. Private Coomer looked up and for the first time witnessed the death of an American soldier. There was just a slight rise on top of this hill, and Sergeant Bissonner lay down and, taking a pair of field glasses, looked across the river. A German spotted him, and I heard the bullet hit him in the forehead. He didn't even groan. On August the 6th, Task Force Weaver of the 90th Infantry Division was pushing east in a 37-mile drive from Fougères toward Mayenne. Reaching Mayenne would place the Americans 30 miles from Avranches, a key point in the encirclement of the 7th German Army. Private First Class C.M. Goodson, 358th Infantry Regiment, was in a unique position to see an oncoming bullet. I saw a bullet coming at me. I was just frozen, and it came in like slow motion. It was turning over end to end. It hit my jacket, covering my chest. I thought I was a dead man for sure. And it just dropped from there to the ground. Probably a sniper from far away. It was just spent. Captain Ivan Schock led the reconnaissance troop of the tough hombres. 2 bridges were blown, but one remaining bridge stood. Watching the last bridge for over an hour, an American sniper saved it from demolition. A Nazi ducked out of a building and tried to run over to the bridge. One of our riflemen knocked him off. When we crossed the bridge later, we found tons of explosives, all fused and ready to be set off. That one shot from the sniper did the trick. Ignorant of the town's capture, dozens of Germans entered, still believing it was in German hands. They were captured by the 90th Division. After the capture of Mayenne, the division pushed on to Le Mans, and then north to Chambord to seal the Falaise pocket. 80 days had elapsed since D-Day, during which 6 armies, 2 German and 4 Allied, had clashed in hotly contested battles as the Germans struggled to contain the invasion. The battle for Normandy had ended in a significant Allied victory. The German armies were largely destroyed, with 500,000 casualties at the cost of 200,000 Allied casualties. Now freed from the confines of Normandy's bocage, the race across France began. Many believed that the war would be over soon. Now then, oh my word, I've just been checking back in episode 53 to see what I covered about Harry Furness. And I have to say, if you like sniping stories, I can highly recommend you picking up that episode sometime. But for now, for a taster, with a story from Gary's book, and a story which wasn't covered in episode 53, here's another Harry Furness story from Normandy. And before I forget, there's an absolutely superb full-length photograph of Harry Furness in the show notes. And it's from the World War II Snipers book. This story is an absolute cracker. It starts with a little prelude on July the 14th, 1944. And on that date, back near Chateau Saint-Côme, Oxenbuck's Private Edwards was stunned by a shell that landed a few yards from his trench. After recovering, he ventured out alone and spotted a solitary German who stepped out between hedges. Apparently, a new unit had relieved the one they'd been fighting. It became apparent to Edwards that, unlike the British practice, the Germans didn't necessarily caution their relief as to the presence of snipers or dangerous spots. Since it was his birthday, Edwards took the shot and brought him down. Despite waiting all day, no new target presented itself. It was 4 days later, on July the 19th, that Edwards added to his tally. An unwary German walked into a gap, and both Edwards and his sniping partner fired simultaneously. Contrary to practice, they afterward peppered the hedge with more bullets to simulate preparatory fire for an attack. After remaining motionless for a while, they had elected to retreat when Edwards spotted another German. Edwards fired as the German flitted across 2 small gaps in the hedgerow, and the German let out a yelp before crashing to the ground. Returned to service after recovering from his injury fighting for the Green Howards, Sergeant Harry Furness was posted to the Hallamshire Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment when he was ordered to scout forward for the battalion. The CO had sent me forward to report back any enemy movement, and if I could spot any dug-in tanks or artillery before we put in a battalion-strength attack. As I very carefully moved around, crawling to get ever better concealed positions, I used my ×20 telescope to get better clarity of where the German soldiers were likely to be concentrated. Soon I found something very unusual. A group of enemy were partly hidden behind a hedgerow with trees near them. They were obviously all officers, so a priority target. As I looked at them intensely, the officer in the centre of their group received deference from the others, as they often looked at him as he was looking towards our positions through field glasses. To spot such a rare grouping was an opportunity I couldn't possibly let pass by, and I had to be fast. I put down my ×20 and picked up my 4T rifle. I was lying prone and quickly estimated the range, which I thought was around 600 yards. Fortunately, I'd loaded some long-range ammo I'd managed to get from the 2nd Battalion of the Kensingtons, who were supporting the Hallamshires with Vickers machine guns. Previously, I'd zeroed my rifle for high-precision hits with this type of ammunition, so when I fired, I was confident I'd secured a good solid hit as the officer in the centre was dropped. I knew he must have had high rank, as he held that order group, but was too far away to identify rank, insignia, or much else. As I fired, I lost my sight picture through the rifle recoil, but was quickly back on target. He was down, and the officers surrounding him were in uproar. I could see, with arms pointing, and I knew then they must have spotted my muzzle flash, as most of them had been looking towards our front lines, and I was concealed in their line of sight. I started immediately to try and crawl out of the way. I didn't attempt to stop any longer to shoot at the other officers. I knew I had to get away fast. The sheer speed of their retaliation was staggering. It seemed to be almost immediate, which I expect followed so fast in view of all their units receiving immediate fire orders from senior officers. Furness managed to escape, but not without injury. The blasts were so close to him that his nose and ears were bleeding. He was carried by the stretcher-bearer to the regimental aid post, where he was debriefed by the intelligence officer. Thanks to the information Furness gathered, the Hallamshire's attack was called off, and they prepared for a German counter-offensive instead. While it was later confirmed that a high-ranking officer was slain, the identity was never divulged to Furness. It didn't matter to him, since he thought it best if he never knew. Listener, I just wonder who it was. Does anybody know? Well, that's it from Harry, and it's nearly it from me. I've just got one final PS to share with you, and this is a story by a guy on Reddit called Sergeant Carbonero. He's featured before in this show, and he's got a little story which, guess what, I've been saving this for weeks and weeks and weeks, but it's about sniping. Years ago, as an EMT, emergency medical technician, I transported a lot of vets. There was this one guy who told me he was trained as a sniper. He didn't want to be a sniper because he'd heard what befell snipers who got caught. So he traded his sniper rifle with a Garand on the first dead GI he saw. One day they were assaulting a hill. He looked up and saw a Japanese soldier with round glasses peering over the edge of an embankment, and he took a shot. The guy disappeared back behind the berm. But he kept looking back over the embankment, and I kept taking shots at him, but I missed every time. I couldn't understand it. Eventually, we took the position, and there were 5 Japanese soldiers on the ground. All dead. All with round glasses. Of course, I'd nailed every one. Oh dear. I'm Paul Cheall, saying bye-bye now.